Great to have you on board and see you all. Just again, reiterating thoughts are with you as we're working through these very challenging times. You'll know New Zealand has had a resurgence, and our colleagues in Auckland are back in a form of lockdown. I, however, have had the privilege of working with a group of beginning principals in New Zealand this morning. I'm in Rotorua in the Novotel Hotel, and have just done a 2.5-hour session with them. So really nice to now be coming over and working with you. So yeah, buckle down. Hope you enjoy the ride with us on this particular focus. And again, there'll be lots of opportunity for interaction, feedback, etc. As we move through the morning. So Alice, if you can just move us on. It's warning me my internet connection is unstable. So Justin, can I ask you to be prepared to jump into the gap if I become mechanical or frozen or anything else?
And it's very unlikely.
Are you able to hear me? Can I just have a thumbs up?
Yes. Got you. And you're never mechanical or frozen, Jack. So if you ever get to that stage, I can jump in. Can everyone hear Jackie?
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks, you guys. Yeah.
Cool. So just a reminder where we're at today is the change management in turbulent times. It's the 4th of our webinar series. We've got the 5th one coming up on Tuesday, the 8th of September, which is going to be looking at building community engagement. And of course, your PLG discussions are ongoing, and your individual leaders of those will be in touch to schedule ongoing times, etc. I'm going to move through this reasonably quickly because we've got a really big day planned, and I think the content is really exciting. So I want to leave as much time for that as I can. But basically, the goals for today are to understand how our brains respond to change and uncertainty. And we think that's really important given the current times. Justin has connected you with the need for certainty. Often in times of uncertainty, that's provided through clarity, but really important to understand the threat and stress reactions of the brain during these times. Then obviously we want to give you strategies to support in navigating that change. I'm going to talk you very briefly through Vivian's work on change to increase improvement, narrowing the focus of improvement and deeply engaging with teachers' theories to increase the likelihood or chance of that working for you. And then we're going to give you an opportunity to just reflect on your learnings and be able to articulate some of the important things that have emerged for you through this time of crisis. Again, we're going to be sending you into breakout sessions. Each time you go in, we'd like someone different to assume the role of host. Just a reminder of the core roles. We want you to orient and focus conversation, manage time so everyone gets an opportunity to share, and then take responsibility for reporting back. And just rotate that each time you go into a breakout session. So just a reminder that when we did the needs analysis session with you guys, this session emerged from you as something that was quite important for you. So some of the reflections that we've thought about as we put this session together are the things that are listed on the screen. So leading change in a small school. What are good, sound change management practices? Taking hold of what has been positive and making sure that we don't lose that, which connects really nicely to our next slide actually. Sustaining change and professional learning. Once the school goes back to normal and busy again, how do you not lose the focus of some of the important things that you've learnt during this time? How do you embed them as part of the new normal? Again, the change in unprecedented times and how to make change happen. We know that I'm not quite sure what that one is. When I'm the only leader, maybe, haven't got a big team around you. So Alice, this was something that we held on to right through COVID, but the thing that I want to talk most about is a reflection on the passing of Sir Ken Robinson. And when I heard about that, I instantly went to, I believe he would be a firm believer of never let a good crisis go to waste. Never waste the learnings that we've had through this time. His work centred largely on whether schools kill or encourage creativity, how we do that. I think in these times we are expected to be more creative than we've ever been. And I think to think really deeply about his big messages in education as we think about change management, as we think about the learning from this time, is something that we should be connected to. There's no doubt about his influence. There's no doubt about his provocation, something I love doing to us all. And kind of like us have him in our heads today, and to have that lens about being creative, about learning about this in ways that can stretch and test better opportunities for us. So Justin, on that note, I'm going to hand to you.
Thanks, Jack. And I noticed that, and good morning, everyone. Great to be working with each of you again today. I noticed that Andrew and others have to go to a network meeting at 10:30. So I would love you to access this deck after today, if you can, and the recording to Andrew and others. There's some fabulous exercises throughout, and there's one towards the end where we use a 5 R's model for almost time capturing your learnings from COVID to enable you to create the opportunities in the future. So I'll just commend you to that, to please grab those from the afternoon today. So the first session, as Jack mentioned, is around how do our brains, how do these things up above our shoulders, how do these things respond to change? And we, as you've become accustomed with us, we sort of reflect back on the neuroscience of change and the neuroscience of how humans adapt and adopt certain practices during change. Now that slide's looking a little bit blank for me. Now there we are. So I think the first thing I wanted to draw our attention to was that in an everyday life, our brains are bombarded by a plethora, a sort of an amplitude of information. And we're receiving, let's call it around about 11 million bits of information every second. And I would contend in the current context we're in, that's been amped up. I reckon, and these figures were from about 16 months ago. So I'm guessing that's probably about 16 million bits of information now, and probably during COVID as the press and other things converge upon us even more. But what's interesting about the brain that we have, the brain evolves obviously a little bit slower than the context around us, and our brain can absorb and consciously process only 40 bits of information at any given time. And so the great deal of information and data we're receiving in our context comes from or comes into our unconscious, yet in our frontal cortex, we can only process less than a small part of 1% of every bit of information we receive. And that's led us, Al, on the next slide, to thinking about this conundrum we face in the modern world called infobesity. This notion that our older brains, our brains which adapt at a slower pace to the context in which we find ourselves, are at a stage where we can absorb and process a limited amount of data, whereas we are on the right-hand side, you can see, being forced to contend with and jostle with a whole range of information all at once. And that, therefore, on the next slide, Al, would help us then also think about what I think is crucial during this time, therefore, and one way we need to think about these magic machines above our shoulders is that attentional intelligence is at the utmost importance during this time. And really, this is almost the third type of intelligence that the literature begins to talk about. There's obviously IQ, which came in around the sort of 50s, last millennia. We had EQ, which Goldman introduced in around about the 1990s. And we're increasingly talking about this notion of attentional intelligence. And I had the great fortune of meeting Linda Ray, who's the CEO of Neurocapability last year. She works out of Brisbane with her team. And this notion that attentional intelligence is that intelligence when highly developed, when we actually hone this art and this skill, and it is a skill we can develop, allows us, this is important here, to effortlessly but mindfully notice where your attention is at. So we can actually almost gracefully, but also know where our effort's at, but then intentionally decide where you want it to be. Intentionally decide, and this is that critical, that there are 4 or 5 executive functions that our brain performs. And having the ability to switch between tasks and show attention to things, or as Linda Ray talks about, attentional intelligence, is one of those 4 or 5 key executive functions that differentiates the good from the great leaders. And so I would commend to you this notion of attentional intelligence to enable us at a time like this to really filter out the plethora of information and data that's coming our way and really focus hard on the things that matter. The second concept I want to remind us of that we've been exposed to in prior webinars is this notion of reward versus threat pathways. You'll have seen this work by David Rock. This came out of his work at the end of 2009. It's been developed over the last decade. I exposed to you last time that notion of change on the left-hand side of this diagram here in the blue arrow. And our brains have the option of going one of 2 ways. They have the option of going down a reward pathway, the option of going down a threat pathway. We can switch on the emotional brain and switch on the thinking brain for more constructive behaviours and decisions, or we can switch on the more natural pathway for the humankind, which is the threat pathway, the more natural pathway, if we don't use that unique filter that Rock talks about being the SCARF model. And so if we, on the next slide, Al, can look at how we can de-emphasize status, how we can increase certainty where we can, how we can give people a sense of control, even for ourselves as leaders, how we can amp up relatedness and belonging, and then ensure there's a perception of fair exchanges between us and others, then we're able to send people and ourselves down that reward pathway as opposed to the threat pathway. So I just wanted to start this morning with those 2 constructs around infobesity and attentional intelligence first, and then just reminding us again of the SCARF model and the threat and the reward and the threat pathway. Important ways in which our brains work under pressure. And I would contend in a context like this, the SCARF model becomes even more important and attentional intelligence becomes even more important, which we need to apply to things like our AIPs, our planning for next year, ways in which we can really focus things and take the noise out of our school context as much as possible so that we can focus on the things that really matter. So the second session today, after having a quick sort of run through as to how our brains are situated in times of change, I want to think through strategies that we as leaders, we as human beings can use to help us navigate during times of uncertainty and times of change. What are some of the things that we use? So I want to start with this question to all of us in this illustrious crew here today to think about what you believe. And I want you to sort of cast your mind back. I want you to think about a time where you've been involved in a significant change. You've either led that change or been a person who's been a key player in that change. And I'm sure you can all connect to a moment in your career so far. So conjure that change up. I want you to share with with the team here what you think are some of those factors for yourself that have impacted your response to change, either in a good or a less constructive way. What are some of those things that you believe has done that? So what I'm going to invite you to do, and you guys are very comfortable demuting your screens if you would like, and or just share in the chat function down the bottom there. What are some of those factors for you in the past have impacted your response to change? Please share with wanton abandon. And even demute. I'd love to hear a voice.
I would say how involved we are in actually how involved we are in that change. Do you know what I mean? Like
involved, I love it.
Or included.
Love that. And I know Jackie will pick that up with aplomb in her session. I love it, Kai. So level of involvement is absolutely critical. Yeah.
And the why, Justin, it's Penny here, the purpose of it
Yeah.
would come first, hopefully.
Loving it, as opposed to just assuming we understand why it's the case. So what's that? And adults and young people alike, connect with that why. Give yourself time. Don't rush if you can. Yeah. How do we actually give ourselves enough time to have the change occur without sort of ushering it through with speed? What else are we thinking about, Jeff?
What's the data or research telling us behind that when we're diagnosing?
Yeah. What's the, yeah, exactly. Blockers. Thanks, Kane.
I think resources, sometimes, we're good at words, but we need to kind of come behind those words with resources.
Yeah, nice. Which is about this whole strategic resourcing construct. Where's the end play? Self-efficacy. Yeah. How confident and effective do I think I am at delivering that change? Thanks, James. I'm loving the comments coming through. Yeah. What are the possible outcomes? Need that sense of what's the end state here? And I'm struggling to keep up with you now because you're sharing them too quickly. I love it. So there are a number of reasons, and I'd love you to keep sharing them as we go. And I want to share with you 3 that we've found from the research that, and we try to keep things simple in 3s, which I think is quite memorable. Some of the factors that we're seeing affecting change. And I think I want you to apply this to yourself. I want you to apply this to the people you lead to understand how you think they would also respond to change as well. So here are the 3. Resourcing, yeah. Time and also physical. That's awesome. Thanks, Nicole. First is personality. It would be remiss of me as a psychologist not to start with personality. You may have heard of the big 5 personality factors. Yeah. It's the acronym OCEAN, OCEAN. I'll let you look that up later. I'll deal with the first and last of OCEAN. The first is openness. So openness to experience. If we've ever done a diagnostic around personality, we'll sit on a continuum from more open to less open. Okay. What we do know is that people who are more open to experience are more likely to be receptive of change or accepting of change. And we are, and what is interesting in the personality literature is that personalities actually, although they're enduring, they can be changed over time by context. And so we can move up the openness scale or down the openness scale depending on certain experiences in our lives. And so we do know for sure that those who are higher on the openness score are more accepting to change. We also know the end part of OCEAN, of those 5 factors, is that quite horribly term neuroticism. And that's often misconstrued. That's basically, are you more likely to worry or are you more likely to be more relaxed with things in general? And we know that people that are high, and we all have a natural proclivity to one way or t'other. We know that people who are higher on the neuroticism scale are more likely to be less accepting of change, more concerned, more anxious about change. So there are some fundamental aspects of humankind and part of our personality that means that we are more open to or less accepting of change more broadly. The middle one is past experiences, and a few of you mentioned, I think your comment, Kai, from the get-go was an important construct there of how have we experienced change in the past? Have we been involved and included? Penny, have we been given the why frame? Have there been enough resources attached to it, James, et cetera, et cetera? So I think this notion of past experiences and our successes and challenges with change predisposes us to want to be more welcoming or less welcoming of change in the future. So understanding people's past experiences with change is very important. And the third one was picked up broadly by some of the comments around cognitions and emotions. In particular, those with higher, and this is the second type of intelligence here, around EQ or emotional intelligence, those with higher EQ often deploy better coping strategies and are therefore more adaptable to the stress that comes with, change definitely delivers stress and discomfort. Right? And so those with high EQ are more likely to be able to cope better in those circumstances. And I put down the bottom there the four key skills of EI, which are emotional awareness, emotional expression, emotional reasoning, and emotional management. If you are able to be more aware of your emotions and the triggers for your emotions, which is the first skill, if you're then able to identify that emotion and express it appropriately And people with higher emotional intelligence have a larger, what we call emotional lexicon. They have more words to describe their emotion. Then we're able to reason better with emotion and actually combine both cognitive data and facts, like Jeff spoke about, with also the emotions of a context to then manage my emotions and the emotions of others better. And so those 4 key skills of AI are crucial as we begin to deal with the change process as well. So they're the 3 biggies: personality, past experiences, and your sort of emotional dexterity as some of the other 3 crucial things that drive a person's response to change. We then want to sort of change the conversation from, if there's some of the predeterminants for how I'm going to respond to change, what are some of the strategies that I can employ? What are some of the strategies that I can employ as a leader for myself, and then in turn for those I lead, to help lead me through and manage myself through change? And this simple work, yet effective work by Stephen Covey, you've probably seen through his Spheres of Influence work. This work, I think, when I work with senior teams and executives and leaders throughout this land and others, I often get them to put 3 circles on a page. Things you can control, things you can influence, and things that are out of your control you can't influence. And I often find myself scrolling these. I know at the start of COVID, I put this on a page for myself and said, what the can I do myself? And I think I would encourage you, as just a basic strategy for yourself, when you face a conundrum in your work or a critical challenge or a change process you're trying to lead, segmenting your thinking into control, influence, and no control or influence is, I think, one of the first key parts of leading yourself through change, and helping you stem perhaps a proclivity towards anxiety or whatever's at play for you, to help you get more of a sense of control over the process. I now want to open the conversation up before I share some more strategies that we find useful during particularly this COVID period. I want to get us into breakouts and get you guys chatting to each other to think about what you believe are some of those strategies that you've used to help you manage change and uncertainty, particularly with the overlay or the guise, if you like, of COVID-19. So I want you to consider this question. Given your personality, and you all know where you sit on some of those scales, we all know deep down where we sit, and our preferences, our working style preferences, what strategies and actions have you used to help you manage change and uncertainty, particularly during COVID-19? And I'd love you to reflect, have they been any different? Have they been different to pre-COVID? Have you deployed new things in this period? Because this is a chance for us to share from our colleagues and understand the sort of things we've used to help us navigate really a once in a many decade event that we're facing. I'm going to get you to have one host in your group. We're breaking into 3 or 4 groups, Elle. What do you think? 4 groups, awesome. Thanks, Karen, for letting us know. We're breaking into 4 groups. We want to have one host in each group. If that host can capture in the Google Sheet, which Alice is sending out now, and then we'll hear back from you in plenary once you've had about 14 minutes together.
8 minutes.
8 minutes together to talk through your strategies, maybe 9. So I'd love you to break out and please upload your thoughts in the Google Sheet. We'll catch you soon. Please press your join. Here they come. Plenty of smiles, that's good. One more room, yeah, was that it? We'd lost a couple at 10:30, I think.
That's everyone. Yep.
Awesome. So guys, I would love to have a quick report back from the host. We saw your content going up, thank you, on the Google Sheet, which will be a resource for you to use after today as well. So this Google Sheet is a great resource for all to use. But group number 1, I know it's impersonal just to call it group number 1, but who was the host of 1 who wants to talk to us? James looked like he was. Is that,
are we group 1?
Yep, we're
there you go. Off you go, mate.
I was group 1. I think Jeff.
Oh, Jeff.
Yeah. So we talked about how it was very different, I guess. Different communities, different ways of working, different personalities. We saw the shift from communication being less consultative and discussion orientated to something a little bit more simple and short and focused on the realities rather than the what ifs. We saw the need and to be calm and face what was happening in a calm, positive kind of light.
Yeah.
We recognised, I think for me the complexities of different staff and their home situations and the need to work remotely meant that we needed to take a individual approach with staff.
Yeah.
We recognised that we shifted, I guess, for some of us from that very formal role sometimes to being more vulnerable and recognising that we were all creating errors, or we were all doing the best we could, and sometimes in retrospect those decisions might have been different.
Yeah.
But that sense that it's always okay to fail, and we talked about failing forward.
Yeah.
And that in itself led to building levels of empathy with staff. That was really important as well. I think they're the key things that for us, we talked about communication being important, and that face-to-face, contact and phone calls between staff is really important, and that shift towards that emphasis on well-being.
Love it. And I think in your output, you had this term, honouring vulnerability, which I think is a beautiful term. So I think that's definitely been almost a relief for leaders during this time. I've found we actually can be more ourselves. We're in our homes or in different contexts. So, that sense of honouring vulnerability is a beautiful term you introduced there. One of the other breakouts, perhaps breakout 4, and we might allow the other groups to talk in the other session. Breakout 4, who was that? Vassie.
Was us. Yes, it was. Hi, Justin. Hi, all. Wanting to honour everyone's reflections fairly, but also try to synthesise the work. We spoke a lot about, and you'll hear my daughter's Ellen Rose there in the background. We spoke about, I suppose, mindset and the way that we engage with our community. So that collaboration with staff and parents, ensuring that virtual voice and agency within a community, which has been brought to another level. Wanting to ensure, I think Judy shared around that growth mindset, that glass half full, but of course understanding that we've all trying to understand those pieces that you shared, Justin, around the things within your control and beyond, and ensuring that mindset of yes, we can do this, we can be successful ourselves, but also as a team. Wanting to connect with community and understanding that in smaller schools sometimes that's easier because there's that personal contact and connection that you can draw from, but supporting parents as well as the team members when you perhaps don't have as many people on board and would like to collaborate in one way, but I think the quote was that sometimes it's easy just to do it yourself at this time when we're all moving at such a rapid pace. The piece is around exposing vulnerability, and I think Jeff touched on that as well, honouring people's vulnerability, and there's such strength in vulnerability. Because of course we're all human and we're working through the professional realms, but also the personal realms of this adjustment and letting people in. And there was a really important piece there around recognising their own emotional reactions there, Kate, I think, shared with, and identifying, isolating the problem, is it about the actual circumstance or is it my own experience? And the last thing in terms of I spoke about the sense of building upon team strengths and understanding as a team how we're going to work through this, and honouring the complementary and supplementary skills that everyone in a team has and building upon those in this setting, working between the IQ, the EQ, and even the AQ, the agility, intelligence that we work through in redefining our personal and professional boundaries as we move through change.
Love it, Vassie, and I'm thank you for letting us into your household too, and the absolute calm and composure you have in that context. Are good on you. Well done. I'm just loving that leadership style there. Well done. So look, I think the other groups have also got their thoughts up there. So I would recommend we all have a look at this spreadsheet after today as well, and also look what other groups are talking about. There are 5 that we've looked at in the research over the last 3 or 4 months that would like to share with you briefly as well, that would like you to put in your back pocket if you would like to call upon any of those during this time as well. And a lot of these you'd probably have practiced in one form or another. The first is around structure and boundaries. When you speak to clinical psychologists, I went to a fabulous session with some clinical psychs about 4 weeks ago, when they're dealing with people who are severely psychologically challenged during this time, the one word they use for their clients, their patients, is routine. And so if they're prescribing routine to people who are in severe mental illness during this time, which we're seeing climb in cases of that, this sense, we know from the neuroscience that having a sense of control reduces uncertainty. So that sense of structure and boundaries is critical. Find your routine, find your cadence, find your structure, and create your boundaries. The second one is around transitions. This is the big one. So we have some global clients who work in a number of countries around the world, and they often work in this context of virtual interaction well beyond and well before COVID. And the big thing is, how do you create transitions in and out of work? How do you create that space? And we know that one of the key executive functions that we have is the ability to actually switch between tasks. I mentioned before that attentional intelligence. So the ability to switch in and out of work is a critical skill that we need to learn during this time as well. And I heard of an example the other day of a senior executive who he would usually drive 30 minutes to work every morning. During COVID every day, he leaves his front door, walks 30 minutes, come back to the front door, starts his day, end of the day he walks 30 minutes as well. So he almost mimics the switch on, switch off that he had pre-COVID in a COVID world. The third is how we think. Fredrickson, a Scandinavian researcher, talks about the bias that we naturally have as human beings to be predisposed to negativity. We were programmed that way from our savannah experience. And as I mentioned, our old brains have taken a while to catch up. We have this sort of negativity bias to enable us to stay alive, basically, to sort of perceive danger in our context. So we have to sort of kickstart and restart that bias in a sense, and skew that bias by having a positivity bias. You probably heard of that construct, and about a 3-to-1 or 4-to-1 ratio is how we sort of negate our natural negativity bias. The fourth one is social connection, interaction. We know that is the #1 insulating factor for well-being and resilience. So where you can create belonging in a socially isolated world is crucial for you guys to do for yourselves. And the final one is staying focused. I've mentioned obviously infobesity and the notion of attentional intelligence, but how do we stay focused and avoid decision fatigue in a time like this? So there are 5 additional ones that I'll get you to perhaps keep in your back pocket if you find yourself a bit sort of out of control in a sense, out of control during change, to bring yourself back to the basics. So that should give a bit of a sense of how we ourselves manage ourselves through change. I want to handball to my fine pink colleague over in New Zealand to talk about, in that wonderful top, JP, to talk about bypass and engage. Jack.
And so what I'm just going to present to you very briefly, and it is just going to be a wee overview, is something that you can access through your department. And if you're interested in that, I'll make sure Sam's in you some further change to increase improvement. And if I can connect you back to the work that I did with you on re-envisioning your AIP just recently, was my challenge around whether you've got too many goals, whether you're trying to do too much in the improvement space, which then feels like a whole lot of change and not necessarily a focus on improvement. So I want to start by just getting you to reflect on the difference between those two things. So Alice, if you can just move us on. So what is the distinction between change and improvement? And Viviane says in her book that to lead change is to exercise influence, which Justin has talked about, in ways that create something different. So you're keen to create something different, as opposed to improvement is to lead improvement, to exercise influence in ways that create something better. And she says the distinction is important for the following reasons. Alice, if you can flick on. Firstly, if you are talking about improvement, it automatically invites evaluative discussion. Improve from what to what, as opposed to we just want to change. So the minute that you do that, you have to start talking and evaluate what's currently happening and why you think that in the long run this will be better. And that ties into assumption number 2, that it prevents the assumption that change will inevitably produce something better than the status quo. We've got lots of evidence in our education system to suggest that change doesn't necessarily improve status quo. That sometimes you will either get results that are similar, or in worst case scenarios, you'll get results that are worse, despite putting a lot of energy into making something better. So it challenges those assumptions, and it requires you to articulate and communicate a theory of improvement. What is it that you think will make the difference? Why do you think it? And how are you going to monitor progress as you deliver the intervention? So I'm going to challenge you now around what our research tells us is the typical approach to leading improvement. And we call this the bypass approach. I want to stress from the outset that bypass can work. And you can't do the alternative on everything. But actually, what traditionally we see is that leaders have a change agenda. Now, ultimately, it's a good agenda. It comes from data, it's evidenced. But what they do, and I was really interested to read in your chat that some of you recognise that you have to stop being the solvers, is you don't only come with the change agenda, you come with the solution. And that's already predetermined. You've decided the program, you've decided the professional learning you're going to implement. And when you consult with the teachers, it's a persuasive process around what you're doing, why you're doing it, and why it's going to be the best thing since sliced bread. It doesn't necessarily engage with their existing practice or get feed in directly from them. When you bypass the teacher's current practice, you get no agreed evaluation of either theory. And so at best, you will get compliance, or at worst, you'll get resistance. People that are not willing to come on board with you at all. And actually, if you're using the language of resistance, Vivian would encourage you to think about the fact that that is a cue that there are different theories at play. And as someone beautifully put in their notes, it's a time to get curious, not furious. Resistance means people are skeptical about what you're trying to do. They have different theories, and it's a time to take notice and learn and inquire. Now, I said bypass can work. It will work if what you are asking sits relatively close to what already guides teacher practice. Then you will get adaptation. People will come on board because you're not asking them to do something that sits outside their realm of effectiveness. Everything we do is by design. Nothing is random. Your teachers teach in ways that they believe are effective for them. They're developed off many theories of effectiveness. And therefore, if you try to change that without showing them where the flaws are, they're going to revert back to that when something doesn't work for them. So that's the bypass approach to change. And Alice, if you can flick me on. A big message that I want you to think about today is I want you to stop thinking about designing the future until you deeply understand the present, for the reasons that I've said. Most leaders manage change intuitively. They rely on their experience, their prior knowledge, they grasp for the thing that they think is going to be successful. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. The causes of most problems are found in the teaching practice of teachers. And unless you can understand what they currently do and why they do it, it's really hard to design solutions that's going to deliberately and explicitly address that problem. So Alice, if you can flick me on to the alternative. I've been through the bypass approach. I'm going to take you through the engage approach. So when we engage a teacher's theory of action, yes, you come with your improvement agenda. Yes, it's based on good information. But this time when you consult teachers around that, you make the problem explicit before you start offering the solution. So those of you that have said you're going to suspend being problem solvers, being solution shoppers, great. You enter into a dialogical process that helps you understand what they're doing and why they're currently doing it. I'll give you a very practical example of this. We worked with a principal a few years ago that was struggling to improve spelling, and that was showing up as a consequence of NAPLAN summaries. And so he knew he had to do something to try and drive up the spelling. He brought in what his friends or his colleagues had said to him was a fantastic spelling program. 6 months later, there was no difference in kids' achievement. He brought in a different spelling program with similar results. He then thought, actually, I need to do some deeper engagement here. He went back to his staff to understand what it was that was difficult about shifting the spelling results. He learned from his staff that a lot of them had gone through Teachers College when process writing was the buzz. I don't know if you remember that time, but I certainly do. You threw away the red pen. Kids learned to spell just through the writing process. They'd gone down a bring your own device. So these people thought that spell check was going to be the answer to the spelling problem. And you can see the mismatch between trying to implement a spelling program and the beliefs and values of the teachers. Not until those two things become discussable and people understand, actually, kids need, even with spell checker, kids need to be able to approximate. You need to get something that resembles something close to the word for spell checker to pick it up. There are discernments that need to be made through in words that are very similarly spelt, sounded, etc. So there was a real need to actually go back and teach spelling more explicitly. With the engagement of teachers, they were able to do that and they got great results. And another recent example, there is a secondary school in your system that is just engaged with students around why they weren't attending at senior levels. It dispelled a whole lot of assumptions about why the kids weren't attending. They learned real reasons for it, and in a very short time, they've turned that attendance around very quickly. So engaging for your more enduring problems is really important. It also helps you identify consequences that you're currently getting that you don't want to lose. And so teachers get a sense of, we're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, we're actually thinking about what's good, what we should retain, but to tweak the areas that are that's preventing us from improving in the way we want to improve. With bypass, you've got a joint decision to change or not to change, and that's really important. Some of you have talked about the critical importance of communicating the need for change. You also need to check the demand for change. In some research we undertook in Northland schools in New Zealand, we put senior leaders in one room, middle leaders in another room, and teachers in another room, and asked them what the priority improvement foci should be. I don't think it would surprise you to say the coherence between those three groups was minimal. And yet it was the leaders' achievement agenda that won over, and the teachers have to implement it. If they're struggling with bigger problems, that's where you're putting undue pressure. That's what creates the resistance. So engaging around your more problematic stuff, the stuff you're really trying to improve, is a really good strategy. So we're going to send you into breakout groups just to be able to process what we've talked about. And I want you to focus on these questions. Think of a complex school team or individual practice that you're trying to improve. Are you using an engagement approach to do that? And what might you do differently to really try and connect better with that person if need be? So Alice, how long?
Maybe 12 minutes or so. Is that all right?
Cool. Yep, thanks, Jane.
Hello.
All right, that's everyone back. Jackie?
Awesome. So just, I'm going to leave my video off because apparently the internet connection is a little bit unstable. So I hope you were able to hear and understand me through that last phase, but would be really interested in getting just a small amount of feedback. And we thought we'd focus on groups 2 and 3 this time. So invite someone from group 2 to maybe talk about what you discussed.
I'm not sure which group I was. This
Was
is
that group 2, Jackie?
Yes, please.
I'll go if my group doesn't mind. We spoke about, we're all pretty much on the PLC type of models, where we've found it really effective that if we narrow it down for staff, that they can feel like they achieve that change, or they feel like whatever we're trying to change is achievable. And the PLC model really, I suppose, fosters that collaboration in using the data, using a hunch, but using the data to back it up. And then it's not a leader just coming in and saying, this is what we need to change. It's going through that, I suppose. Evaluate and diagnose the problem through the data, not what the leader's saying. So that promotes collaboration and allows them to see it. So I think we're all on the same page in our group that collaboration model. I think Simone in our group had 3 schools in one meeting through Zoom. I think it was, might have been before lockdown, and they were able to be together and they were collaborating on improvement across 3 schools, which is pretty impressive. It's hard enough in one school, let alone 3. So
Absolutely, Luke.
yeah, that was about it from our group. We're all pretty much on the same page with that.
Great. Thank you, Penny.
You're on mute, Pen. There you go.
We had a really productive conversation. One was about a team of prep teachers with a leader and some grads, and the leader had been away for surgery, and then we've had COVID, so people haven't been at school. So how to support the teachers with their practice on one level, and also relationship building. So that was met through having other leaders come in and work with the teachers, and now they're at the stage of building relationships and having ownership of that by coming up with wonderings about what might help the team. And I think a really important word that came up was for especially the leader not to see it as an intervention, as an attack on her, but for the group to come up with their own solutions. and another one was about perhaps having to use a bypass model at another school because you're in a deficit. So the leader then has to make some decisions about this has got to be cut. So that there was a time for that. And on the other hand, wanting a maths team to give feedback in a more timely way, that was going to be a more measured, slowed down approach to get them to look at their own practices and valuing their work, but then still get them to see that they need to give more timely feedback. And, sorry, I'll just turn the page. We also talked about the other two discussions were about the community and having the pressure from families for students to return to school. So the principal was really in the middle at having to make the decisions and work with the emotions and anxieties of families and staff, whilst consulting with the department had to make the decisions. That's what you think about when you go to bed. But it was a good process that the presenter had, in that they would talk to parents and then say, I will get back to you in 24 hours. And then in the meantime, go and consult with teachers about the discussion and then get back to the parent. So that was a good way to engage. And the other discussion was about engaging parents so they will not be so scared of change and get to know the school by having online trivia nights, which I guess is introducing a bit of fun. So it was a very varied discussion in our group. Thank you.
Right. Thank you. And I think you've illustrated really nicely there how bypass can be effective and is sometimes appropriate. As I stressed, for those more complex problems, the things that you've been grappling or trying to improve for a longer time, then the engaged approach is pretty critical. The other thing, just as a final thought, is I provoked quite heavily around the fact that conversations are windows into cultures. Are you aware of the quality of conversations that are happening in your PLCs? Is there appropriate balance of support and challenge? Are the PLCs getting to the heart of teacher assumptions, and are you testing those rigorously rather than acting off assumptions? Because that's where you can get into trouble. But great to hear you're working in that collaborative space. Because as this last slide says, the key to improvement is to collaboratively discover the theory of action that maintains the practices you want to improve. If you understand what sustains what's currently happening, then you can evaluate that and work on that together to get the improvement required. So thanks for engaging with that. I'm going to hand you back to Justin now.
Thanks, Jack. And I think Jack mentioned in her slides that we can't design the future until we deeply understand the present. I think that's one construct I want to end this session with, around helping us reflect to deeply understand our current context, the predicament we've been facing for the last 5 or 6 months, and to extract our learnings from that so we can use these to help us design our future. Okay, so we know that in times of crisis, so this whole thrust today is around how do we lead in times of change and turbulent times. Creating times to pause, I know feels counterintuitive when the hurly-burly of change is upon us, but the ability to pause and stop is what I think actually differentiates the great from the good leaders. And we've been using this model in the last couple of months with leaders like yourselves across this land. And it relates to our adaptation of some work from the Henderson Institute. The Henderson Institute is our entity that comes out of the Boston Consulting Group. The Boston Consulting Group are a global consulting firm in about 70 nations. I used to work there about 2 decades ago. And they're known for their sort of foresight and forward thinking. So these 5R models, which we've adapted for the purposes of these conversations, helps us think through our learnings at each phase or each step. I'm going to explain to you the 5Rs model and get you to situate yourselves in each of these Rs and to think about the learnings you're extracting from each of those. And we're going to send you, probably given time, we're going to probably explain the exercise to you and have you complete that before the next PLG to be able to extract your learnings from the process. So I'll just explain this to you, and please just think about, perhaps jot down what you think are some of the crucial learnings for yourself during each of these phases. The first is the response phase. There's been the immediate response to pandemic as it's emerged, obviously in March and April. There's been the remote learning that's occurred. There's been lockdowns. There's been school closures. So I'd get you to think about what you've learned through that response phase that's happened throughout the last 6 months in terms of setting staff and students up with the appropriate tech and resourcing, things like school closures. I know that some of you and other of your colleagues have experienced that incredibly stressful time of school closure. Care for and accommodation for students of essential workers, and then the multiple contexts we've moved to, from in school, out of school, in school, out of school, that whole back and forth of experience. So as the leader, what have you learned about yourself? What have you learned about yourself during that response phase? In the recover phase, what have you learned about yourself as you've climbed back to the surface? Probably a number of times of climbing back to the surface. As our nostrils have just bobbed above water each time, what have you learned? In terms of when remote learning may have been in flow for you, when remote learning was just galloping along and you thought, jeepers, we are recovering well here. Things like feedback from parents and other key stakeholders, and the monitoring of the mental health and well-being of both staff and students. So I'd love you to think about that recover phase and what you as a leader have extracted from that phase. The third and very important phase is that reinvention of the future that Jackie spoke about, in terms of how do we reinvent that new normal. And these are things like, what are some of the learnings you've adopted from lockdown 1? What are some of the ways you've learned about new ways of working and conducting meetings? What are some of the things you've learned about the infusion and the inculcation of technology in teaching and learning? I also should emphasize that these 5 R's are not linear and sequential. We find ourselves looping back to response as new things emerge in our context. The 4th phase is reinforce. How do we reinforce and encourage the embedding, if you like, of new attitudes and behaviours that we've learned through this period? And they're things like, what have been the role of routines and the role of accountabilities, of PDPs, of AIPs, of school reviews in your process so far? How have you managed resistance, as Jackie referred to, in terms of some people perhaps resisting coming back to school in some instances, as we've seen in the last sort of period of back to school sort of period? And how have you encouraged the champions of change, those leaders and those people in the school who have stepped up and adopted new practices and really helped you drive your school during this period of change and chaos? And the final one is risk manage. How have you identified, addressed and mitigated new emerging risks during this time? Have you got processes for future school closures in place, and what have you learned about that? What's your business continuity planning looking like? What learnings have you taken there? And what are your communication plans looking like? How have you learned through the process of if you like, constant communication to risk manage your stakeholders going forward? So I'm going to get you to think about, across response, recover, reinvent, reinforce and risk manage, the learnings you've had. And on the following slide, we're going to get you to take this away with you and have a bit of a play with this in this sort of the quiet reflection time that we seem to be getting at 3 a.m. in the morning at the moment. I'm not sure about you, but our cortisol levels, actually interestingly, are spiking at 3 a.m. at the moment. There's a study out of Monash that was released 2 weeks ago that, given the heightened level of anxiety we're all feeling, that 3 a.m. is the time where a lot of people are waking and staying awake. So if you're feeling it, it's normal at the moment, it's okay. So what I'm going to suggest to you is, if you are getting some quiet time to reflect, I'd love you to apply those 5 R's across 4 stakeholder groups. 1, yourself. What have you learned about yourself in each of those 5 phases? What have you learned about staff in each of those 5 phases? About students and about parents and carers more broadly. And I think, in a sense, you may do yourself a favour by almost time capsuling the last 6 months and saying, if I, you know, it'd be difficult not to actually fill out each of those cells, I think. I think there's been so much learning across this entire matrix here of thinking about what have I learned across those 5 R's and what have I learned from the perspective of each of those stakeholders. So I'd love us to ponder this and take it in our back pocket. And I think we'll start our next PLGs, Jack, asking you guys some reflections on this, because I think we did it with another group of about 60 principals the other day. I think it was Monday, Tuesday this week. And they found this incredibly useful exercise to ponder themselves in terms of extracting those learnings and time capsuling this really precious period we've had in some ways to really reflect and adapt and change things.
And Justin, can I just add in there that one of the groups said they'd like to add an additional group into that stakeholder section, and that's for those of you that are lucky enough to have leadership team to be another critical group as we move forward. So you might like to think about that as well.
Nice, Jack. So it becomes a 5 by 5. It's even neater. I like it's my Scandinavian background coming through. So a nice 5 by 5 matrix if you want to add leadership team as well. So we lead you with a couple of provocations to wrap up our time, and we're beautifully poised here for an 11:30 wrap up. The first parting provocation is how have you, and when you think about each of those 4 or 5 stakeholder groups in your reflections, how have you or how will you access the lived experience of each of those groups that you're going to think about as you do your reflection? And how will you validate what you know? How will you validate what you know? So you may have a reflection on, in the recover phase, from the parent and carer perspective. How do you know that? How are you going to access that lived experience so you can validate your learning, so your time capsuling is an efficacious process? So I'd get you to ponder that, accessing the experience from each of those stakeholder groups and validating it with them. The second provocation, we end where we begin. There's a movie that I think starts or ends with that statement, I think, somewhere. So basically, I'd love us to ponder from that statement that Jack made at the start, the Winston Churchill quote around never wasting a good crisis. I want you to ponder, so what are you going to do as leaders in our system here in Victoria? What are you going to do to ensure you don't waste a crisis? And I love it. And I think perhaps one of the first steps for that is time capsuling our learnings to then think about that as a fillip to redesigning our futures. And in doing so, redefining the futures of young people in this state.
And can I just add to that, opportunity to be really creative. This gives us an opportunity to think outside of the square. So remember those,
Jack.
I think amazing teachings from Sir Ken Robinson, and think about the opportunity this for doing things different.
Thanks, Jack. And I'll interpret some of the funky tunes there from Jack. Be creative and innovative. Sir Ken would love it, in honour of him. Sorry, Jack, you were sort of cutting out a bit there. So we would love, if in the chat we've sent you the link to Slido. If you can, we're a couple of minutes under time, which is a good thing. If you could just spend 90 seconds now in this session providing your feedback. We love your feedback. We genuinely see it as a gift. We're trying to respond to it by creating more time to break out to hear your peers in conversation as well. So hopefully you're seeing us adapt these webinars as we traverse through. And then I'll briefly close in a moment. Just perhaps go into that Slido now. And while you're completing that, has everyone got the Slido in their chat? Everyone's got that? Ripper, thanks Sarah team. I might just therefore highlight what's happening coming up for us. We're actually heading towards our 5th webinar. I'm going to get a bit teary, I think, at our final webinar. So we're heading towards our 5th. We've loved spending time with you at regular intervals through this pandemic we've been traversing together. So we're going to spend some time thinking about community engagement in the next webinar. That's on the 8th of September. So looking forward to seeing you as a collective then again. Our 3rd PLG session is coming up. I know for my groups, we've got times in our diaries for those. And that will then round out our online experience together. in terms of this sort of series of conversations we've had throughout the last, it's been, what, 3 or 4 months now that we've been together doing this. So it feels like you're old friends now, and we're looking forward to obviously working with you very soon through the webinar and PLGs. Thanks for your feedback in terms of the evaluation of this particular webinar, this particular workshop. We do wish you very well over the coming weeks. We know you're doing a momentous job on behalf of all our young people here at Victoria, so go well. And yet again, great to work with you all. Take care of yourselves. Thanks, guys. Thanks, Jeff. Thanks for completing the survey, guys. Love it.
Karen, do you have any questions?
Is diligently doing the survey. Thanks, Karen. Thanks, Karen, champion. I'll see you soon at PLG. You're on mute, but I know what you're saying.